Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the first upload of 2025, January 1st. We're looking at a really interesting development related to the 155th Mechanized Brigade. In earlier updates, I discussed huge issues in relation to that brigade. I discussed massive issues that at the time were not really discussed by the general public. The issue was just sort of brewing, and now, due to the investigation being opened up by Ukraine's State Bureau of Investigations, and due to an article written by the military journalist in Ukraine, Yuri Butusov, it's become commonplace over the past couple of days to discuss this on Ukrainian public forums, but I was sounding the alarm about this nearly a month ago. So really, I was ahead of the curve in this regard. But now we're going to go through the entire story, as now we have a lot of details in relation to the creation of the brigade, the amount of people that have gone AWOL or deserted. It's just absolutely crazy. And I also want to just point some fingers. I want to set the record straight about who's to blame for the entire scandal, and not just for this one unit, but for more generally some of Ukraine's military strategy and how it's related to the political ambitions and political decisions made by some of the leadership in the higher echelon. But first, I want to look at the frontline updates. And of course, everything will be timestamped so you guys can go to the area of your choosing. But I want to begin by looking at Kurakhove, where now we just have continued confirmation from the Ukrainian side of a Russian advance into the industrial zone. So, at the very least, we're going to be the most charitable to the Ukrainian side in terms of the territory that they still retain. We could say that the Russians have been able to advance deeper into this location over here around the thermal power plant and are approaching the entirety of the Electrostal mechanical plant and the other mechanical facility located a bit further to the west, all of them along Zaporizhzhny Road, of course. And by that point, in the scenario that the Russians are able to take over all of those industrial facilities, they will only be about 700 meters away from Dakhnia and about, 8 kilometers away from Mulakli. That is really, really close to Andrivka, and you could see how on the map the Russian vector advance is very clear. It also includes the push that is going on right now in Shevchenko, so you could see a scenario wherein the Russian gains that are currently being paved by three particular Russian brigades, the 5th, 110th, and 114th, could unite with the Russian vector of attack that is occurring a bit to the north from Stary Terny to Shevchenko. And then you could see these parallel gains occurring both north and south of the Vavt River, which is pretty shallow and pretty narrow at this specific location. And you also have the perfect conditions for armored assaults going towards the Avdiivka or Andrivka suburbs. And so that's something to keep in mind going into the future. And the Ukrainian side, we're going to have to keep a keen eye out for how they consider their next steps, the process by which they withdraw from the remaining locations in the industrial zone, the trenches and tree lines south of the industrial zone, and then Dakhnia, if they have the ability to even retain control over here after so many territorial shifts in recent days. You know, the momentum not being on their side and constantly having to withdraw from one position to another, it creates invariably chaos within the ranks of the local garrisons, the companies or platoons that are operating over there. And so we're going to have to see what ends up occurring in Dakhnia, because Dakhnia is just so important, not just for the Kurakhove garrison of the 46th Brigade, but for all the other Ukrainian units that are defending right now in Yantarnia or more generally north of the Sukhyali River, because there are not many actual settlements within this pocket that you could see now. It's becoming more and more palpable every day. There's another pocket that is formed due to the Russian pressure from the south, from the east, and from the north. And one of the only, I suppose, nearby positions that troops can organize around and branch out from is Dakhnia. So the loss of this would spark the end, in my view, for the entirety of this pocket. And by doing so, it would mean that the Ukrainians lose a huge buffer that is sort of diverting attention away and resources away from the battle in Andrivka itself. And so that would be a bad scenario for the Ukrainian defenders currently digging in that city. Now, to zoom in, you could also see the Russians have been able to advance deeper into Shevchenko. They're doing so along a narrow corridor, but nonetheless are experiencing success. They've taken over nearly the entirety of the village, and that means that they are in close proximity to a lot of the trenches built. And a lot of these are not recent. Actually, most of them are from the 2015 period. And so now the Russians are very close to flanking and taking over many of these fortresses that have direct access to Andrivka from the east. Now, to look at the Pokrovsk front, we could zoom in over here and see that there have been intense clashes going on by both sides in Novovasilivka. Russian forces advancing on private vehicles in some cases, mainly in armored vehicles like MTLBs, towards the southern and eastern approaches of the settlement. So you could see the vectors of attack over here, some of it coming from Novotroitsk itself, which is completely understandable. Novotroitsk is very important as a forward Russian linchpin for attacks. And now there is this two-pronged assault going on. For the time being, the Ukrainians have been able to retain control over the village, but it is in a bit of a complicated situation because you do have the Russian advances continuing in Solone, which is located a bit to the northeast. And also, the village is sort of boxed in because the Russians have control over the southern flank. Any sort of supply coming in from the west is hindered due to how close it is to the Russian lines. And then to the north, you have the Solona River, which is pretty shallow, but again, it just drags to the process of moving in and out of the village. So it is a complicated area to defend, but the Ukrainians currently are holding on. But it is not by any means a long-term defensive area that could be held on to just due to the nearby circumstances. And so the Russians are already looking at the next steps of moving into the nearby villages that are all running along the same river valley. And that's a part of how they were able to take this position over here in Solone, which is nearly under full Russian control. You also have the Russians expanding west of Vovkove. This is important because the Russians are now making moves to cut off the highway that connects to Pokrovsk. And you can see how this highway, it originates in Mezhova and even further westwards in really important cities throughout Dnipro and even Zaporozhye Oblast. And then it filters its way all the way to the key city of Pokrovsk. And now the Russians are only, say, 2 kilometers away from it. So within the range of mortars, short range mortars, soon it's going to be within the range of small arms fire. And so it's going to become way more difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply and move in and out of the village without having to worry about their flanks being targeted with direct fire. Also, the Russians are beginning to close in on the heights that these areas are located on because you have the T0406 highway and the local rail line, both located on the main ridge in this region, in this sort of like area west of Pokrovsk, pretty close to the Solona River Valley, you could say. And I'm just going to highlight the perimeter for you guys over here so you get an idea of what I'm referring to. But these are the higher elevated regions and they expand into the city center. So the Russians now have the ability to level the playing field because for the most part, the Russians are advancing on areas that are of lower elevation. But by getting control over the severe position, they're going to be on elevation parity with the Ukrainians. And in some cases, like with these fields over here, or say the fields over here, some of the settlements that are not necessarily within Pokrovsk itself, but are sort of like on its periphery. Some of them are in a bit lower elevation. So all of those regions will become sort of overlooked by the Russian side. And there's also the added benefits of complicating Ukrainian logistics. So all of that is a part of the Russian calculus with now the regions that they're advancing through. And it's important to note that the Ukrainians are beefing up the amount of reinforcements in this location. So you have, for instance, the 33rd Assault Regiment. Previously, it was called the 33rd Assault Battalion, but it's now been upgraded to a regiment. That is because it now has 2 assault battalions, not just one, and it also has a tank company. So this unit, I'm pretty bullish on it. It's getting a lot of Western equipment, and it started off as a pretty tight-knit force. They are consistently like uploading footage of themselves engaging with the Russian side in battle and holding on to some of the key areas. And they've actually been shown operating some of the advanced Western equipment. And so this unit is going to continue receiving sort of like reciprocity from the Ukrainian general staff and more equipment as a result. So it could be upgraded even further if necessary in the future. But it's one of the key units that is currently defending over here for the Ukrainian side. And we're going to get to some of the other units like the 155th that is also supposed to be operating around here later on in the video. But I first want to go and look at what's going on here in Toretsk, because in Toretsk you have just another minor Russian advance. These gains that we talked about yesterday in Cherchibinivka and in the northwestern portion of Toretsk, they of course occurred in the last upload, so I'm not going to mark them with the yellow polygon anymore. But the area that I do want to highlight today is this Russian advance, albeit it is smaller than some of the others that we've discussed in recent days, but it is still a 200-meter advance deeper into some of the locations that are less dense. These are the areas where you do have some remaining Ukrainian resistance, but the Russians are moving at a pretty fast pace over here. So December 31st, this is when the video was uploaded by the Predator Police Brigade, and they just dropped 2 grenades, killing a Russian soldier that was carrying a mine, because you see that a lot over here. Individual infantry carrying these large anti-personnel or anti-tank mines, and then throwing them into houses to cause them to just collapse and cave in on themselves entirely. That's supposed to sort of take away the advantage of Ukrainian soldiers being able to hide in those houses and drag out the fighting as a result. So that's what the Russians are doing. You could also see how they have these 2 very strong pincers, and they're maneuvering in opposite directions in such a way that leaves the mine dump over here, mine dump number 10, in a bit of a wedge, really trying to squeeze those Ukrainian forces out. And also, any Ukrainian forces located further south in the local school or in some of those houses or in these warehouses over here, they're beginning to experience the effect of the Russians enveloping and flanking them. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, the Russians are also probing at many weak points. That's something they've been able to do successfully in this location. For instance, in the area north of what's it called? Kolonka, that's the name of this district. They were able to find a weak point in the Ukrainian line in an area that was not dense at all and had a lot of open gardens. They pushed through that area and were able to reach a depth that really was unheard of previously in this urban battle. And as a result, it just caused chaos for the sort of local stable front line. And so now the Russians have the opportunity to seep in over here and expand even further and take over the entirety of this northwestern district. In addition, we're seeing something similar unfold in this northern district of Toretsk, which is connected directly to Krimske. So we're now entering the final stages of that urban battle. Now I want to tell you guys about the story of the 155th Mechanized Brigade, and it has broader implications. I'll tell you guys why. So this occurred post counteroffensive, like we're talking early 2024 or late 2023. Zelensky was envisioning this plan of creating 15 or 14 NATO standard brigades in Ukraine. So the brigade would be formed in Ukraine, the headquarters would be trained in NATO countries, and then they would also receive NATO training and, say, equipment, all of the modern weaponry coming from there, applying some of the same NATO tactics as well. So that was Zelensky's vision, and a lot of it was also a political vision, because he thought that those NATO countries, particularly from the EU, would get on board with that plan, and as a result, they would be more willing to provide those Ukrainian infantry and those nascent Ukrainian units with the necessary equipment and support needed to form those brigades. And then it would just overall increase the Ukrainian military's standards when it comes to whatever weaponry they have and their level of expertise. So that was sort of the ideal vision of it. And a lot of it also goes hand in hand with some of the plans that Zelensky has always had for conducting offensive activities, not just focusing on the defensive front, but also on opening up new vectors of attack that are completely unrelated to whatever defensive arenas there really are. And you could see that sort of manifest with what's going on right now in Kursk. But of course, the newly formed Ukrainian units that started to open up in late 2023, they're not the ones that are spearheading the attacks in Kursk. Those are mainly being done by, or they were done, say, in August, and up to this day are continuing to be maintained by the air assault forces. And those units have always been around. And so maybe there is still this hope in the future for another Ukrainian offensive in an area that is completely unrelated to the current hot sectors. That's certainly a possibility based on the trends of continued opening of new brigades throughout the late 2023 up until now, basically. And you have brigades from the series of 140, so that would be their number, 140th Mechanized Brigade, running all the way up to the 160th Mechanized Brigade. And so in total, you have 15 of these new mechanized brigades that have been formed. And the ideal vision is that they would get that sort of NATO equipment and training, and each one would cost about 900 million euros to build up. And that's mainly not in cash, like giving cash or expending cash on the brigade for training. It's mainly consisting of the amount of worth for all of the equipment that is either currently in European reserves or that would have to be doled out after new production. And so that's where the estimate for the value of each brigade's sort of like upbringing would come from. And so the 155th Brigade is sort of a pilot of this Zelensky vision, and of course signed off by the other higher echelon defense officials like Umarov or Sirski. So they're all a part of this story as well. And so the 150th Brigade was sent to France. It was sent to France in September, but the unit itself was formed in March. In June of 2024, that's when in earnest it began to recruit soldiers. But the issue is by July and August of that same year, 2024, they had already gotten thousands of recruits, and those recruits were siphoned off by other Ukrainian brigades that needed them due to massive infantry shortages. Because, see, even though the Ukrainian new brigades, those 15 new brigades that I talked about, they were able to fill up the ranks, many of them were able to at least, other already established brigades, and there's so many examples of this, but say like the 59th Brigade, 72nd Brigade, all the air assault units, 68th Jaeger Brigade operating around here, 93rd Brigade, list goes on. All these units, they had to varying degrees their own issues when it comes to filling up the ranks due to the attrition of years of war on key parts of the front line, and so they really wanted to get their hands on these new recruits. A lot of them actually being of a higher quality during the initial enlistment period when the brigade was being formed. And so they took whoever they really chose, and there wasn't much of resistance from the 155th Brigade side and from the higher ups about it. And so, of the original cast of soldiers that were supposed to enlist in this brigade, this newly formed brigade, 2,550 of them were siphoned off during the summer to other Ukrainian brigades that were already established. And so the 155th Brigade sort of took this role of being a donor brigade, not really being any sort of massive structure on its own. And this really does not line up timeline wise in a good way for the unit, because after losing the majority of its manpower in July and August of this year, it was sent to France in September. So this brigade was transferred to France in September with only 1,924 men, which meant that there were a lack of skilled ATGM operators or drone specialists, because the infantry, they had to have enough of them trained in France. And so a lot of the people that otherwise would have been sent to those companies related to specialized, roles like drones and ATGMs or electronic warfare, like I said, instead they were sent and just given the basic infantry training, which meant that later on, once the unit was sent back to Ukraine, there were issues with the lack of understanding of how to, actually work in those specialized roles when they actually were assigned to those roles, like being a drone operator in one of the companies attached to an assault battalion. So that was a issue later on. But in September of 2024, the main issue was just the lack of manpower. And there was also the issue of command, the fact that the command was haphazardly created. Whenever you create a brigade, you also have to create and establish a strong officer corps and a command echelon. And a lot of the time, this becomes bloated, and people are promoted who don't actually have the skills to become commanders. And so you have so many different brigades forming, and then a lot of the time, those command posts become bloated, and then they're not effectively able to deal with the infantry assigned to each unit. Of the 1,900 that had been sent to France, only 51 of them had more than 1 year of experience of actual fighting. The majority of them had not fought at all and were new recruits. This was against the sort of messaging that Zelensky gave to Macron when he displayed the vision for this brigade. When it was thought of to be a unit or a corps made up of a very strong, experienced amount of soldiers who would actually be able to go in and learn whatever was necessary. And so that's how it was sold to France, and what Zelensky was hoping to sell maybe later on to other countries that would be willing to train the other 14 brigades created over the past year and a half, you could say. But in this first pilot example, it just became the reality that the majority of them were not trained. They did not have the proper cohesion. And actually, 50 of them deserted while they were in France. They tried to escape. And I believe it's implied that they just ran off to somewhere within France and just left the training camps, which became a massive scandal because, of course, there are diplomatic and political ramifications for the relationship between Ukraine and France, because like it leads to more distrust when it was sold to the French as a highly skilled group of soldiers that were going there to be trained with like highly skilled Ukrainian commanders that would accompany them. But a lot of the commanders were newly promoted and didn't really know what they were doing. And a lot of them were only now becoming accustomed to a smaller group of soldiers because so many of the initial soldiers had been siphoned off to other units. A really shocking fact is that during the 9 months of the brigade's existence, it has gone through 7 staffing changes, 7 overhauls. That is absolutely crazy. You can't have any stability under those sort of conditions. And the specific training for leadership was cut very, very short due to all of those vicissitudes. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at the broader issues, the systemic issues related to this unit. The fact that the command was never able to like get fully formed, and then obviously they can't effectively deal with the issues when that's the case. So the problem is, while those units or while those troops were training in France, for those couple of months in September and October, you had a massive amount of troops in Ukraine sign up. You had about 4,000 additional Ukrainian soldiers, in addition to the 2,000 in France, sign up for the 155th Brigade. And they were doing that while the entire command cast was located in France. So they had nowhere to go. They were just waiting in training camps, not actually training camps, they were waiting in the camps of Operational Command West. Operational Command West is the broader umbrella that this brigade was assigned to. So they were waiting in those camps for the rest of the 2,000 men to return from their training in France. And during that time period, they were trained by the operational commands, specific instructors, but it was really poor quality training. So then the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, they moved in some of their own men to come in and help. But again, it was in very small quantities and it was futile. So the majority of the unit isn't even training where it was supposed to be because they signed up too late to go in and fight. And so they were all just stranded there until about, say, November, because in November, that's when the Ukrainian infantry started to return, but the infantry returned from France before the command. So the infantry made it back to the operational command's post in the Ukrainian rear, and they sort of like met up with the rest of the 4,000 men that signed up. But the actual leadership, like the battalion and brigade commander, they were all stuck still in France until November 30th. That's when they came back. And by that period, enough time had passed that the operational command structure, the commander of Operational Command West, already thought that it was necessary for the brigade, for the 155th Mechanized Brigade, to be moved to fighting in Pokrovsk. And that was at the same time that the actual headquarters leadership returned from France. So just as they were returning, the unit was already being sent to the front lines. So there was no time period, there was no window of time for the brigade commander and his subordinates to go in and get accustomed to the new 4,000 men. So they had had no communication whatsoever. So those 4,000 men were going in without any sort of modicum of training or connection with their higher ups. And the 2,000 men that had trained in France, they were not getting their sort of debrief from the France mission. So that was just a complete disaster, and you have to blame the operational command leadership for that. But by the time that they had been given the orders, it was too late to reverse it. And the soldiers, those 6,000 soldiers, they were already being moved to the Pokrovsk region. Now, during this time period, you just have a massive increase in the amount of people going AWOL or deserting. In total, before the fighting and up to it, I believe up until this point, there have been 1,700 recorded AWOL or desertions. And that's absolutely crazy. Now, when you add in the amount of new recruits and the amount of people that are siphoned off, and then the people that are leaving and don't want to join the brigade, I think the size of the unit at this point and paper should be 5,000 because the total amount is around 6,000. But then when you do some of the subtraction of the recent people going AWOL, it gets to the point of being around 5,000. Because over the past couple of months, you've had nearly 1,000 people go AWOL. So I think it's 5,000, but in actuality, the brigade itself doesn't actually have 5,000 people because even now, up until this very moment in time, you do have elements of the brigade being chipped away and snatched by other neighboring units in the Pokrovsk region for their own purposes. So this is still going on. So the unit is still not fully built, but they were sent in, I'm saying, the ones that didn't desert to fight in Pokrovsk. And it's actually a really large amount of troops when you think about it. So it could have had pretty good potential when you think about it. either as a fully fledged unit or just as troops that would have never been a part of this unit but absorbed into other units that definitely needed that manpower. Additionally, this unit had really good equipment given to it by France. It was given the Leopard, given some of the Leopard tanks, most notably the Leopard 2A4. It was given the AMX 10s, the VAB armored vehicles. So all of this top-notch French equipment. It was given Caesar artillery, self-propelled howitzers. It was given mortars, but we'll get to that in a second. The issue with the mortars. It was given basically everything except for drones and electronic warfare. And when you're given this top-notch equipment, but not given the proper reconnaissance or FPVs, then everything else becomes worthless. And so for 10 days, they were fighting at the front line without any drones. That's absolutely crazy. Every single unit, both Russian and Ukrainian, has a massive amount of drone infrastructure given to it, and let alone electronic warfare. That's absolutely necessary to prevent Russian, attacks on their own to target Ukrainian equipment and troops. And so that led to massive casualties during the first 10 days. It led to damaged equipment. The vehicles that were given by the French to the Ukrainians were damaged immediately after they were deployed to fight in areas like Pischane, Shevchenko, Novotroitsk, etc., because they didn't have any electronic warfare or any other like armored protection on the top or on the sides of the vehicles. They were just given the equipment without anything ancillary to support it. And that's just a disaster when nearby units had basically everything they needed when it comes to drones. And again, there's the issue with the lack of experienced drone operators in this unit because all the drone operators were trained as infantry during the France operation. So after 10 days, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense gave them 17 million euros, I believe, in money to purchase drones. And so that was important, but it was too little too late. And also they just tried doing these crowdsourcing campaigns, and a lot of the Ukrainian grassroots military movement came in to support them and give them drones, but again, happened after getting deployed. That's a nightmare scenario and led to a huge amount of casualties. We're talking about dozens of new recruits that had never seen fighting experience before getting killed immediately after getting deployed to the front line. And that's just a huge crisis for an area like this in Pokrovsk that is extremely important to hold on to. When it comes to the mortars, they were given these 120 millimeter mortars, but none of them worked. Not all of the munitions were tested and none of them exploded. And there was also the issue with the artillery operators not having proper experience. So they were learning how to fire the Caesars on the job. So instead of getting trained on the rear on how to fire them, they were learning how to fire them during the ground combat with the Russian soldiers, which is just an insane condition. It's just something that is difficult to cope with. We actually have here a record from December 21st of the 155th Brigade not operating in Pokrovsk, but actually operating in Velika Novosilka. So this is what I mean when I say that the unit is being split up into portions. So in this case, one of the portions has access to a Caesar self-propelled howitzer and was conducting artillery strikes with the help of the Manticora UAV units onto Russian positions in Novi Komar. So that's just another sort of anecdote about the situation. But another major issue is that the commander of the brigade, his name is Ryumshin, I think it's Dmitro Ryumshin, he was held responsible for the scandal in France because you had the 50 soldiers that deserted, and they deserted probably due to just a lack of connection with the higher ups. They were not communicated with properly, and they just took the opportunity to go into France and leave Ukraine permanently. I think that's what happened based on the translated Ukrainian article that I read. Of course, Google Translate is not the most reliable when it comes to interpreting everything, but that's just my understanding of the situation. And so he was held responsible by the Ukrainian higher ups. And right after he returned from France on November 30th, after a couple of days, he was removed from his post. And then one of the other higher ups in the brigade, that was one of the founding members, he died of a heart attack recently. And I don't know if it was related to the entire ordeal, but obviously it adds stress that the entire unit is just in a state of disarray. And so it just overwent two massive leadership changes ever since it has been deployed to the Pokrovsk area. So now a couple of weeks have passed and the investigation is being opened and a new cadre of commanders are being instilled, but it's just something that should not be happening once it's already in the thick of it in this very intense fighting. That's something that is just unacceptable for a unit, especially one where nearly the entirety of the unit is filled with new recruits. These are not the old ones, the old cast of the 155th Brigade was actually pretty strong and had some experienced soldiers that were looking to get some of that advanced weaponry. But those soldiers were, of course, chipped off by the existing units that needed that manpower. And that's why I think that in the first place, it was not wise to create these units, to create these 15 new units, when that leads to a bloated officer cast. And when the actual infantry, the ground soldiers, are needed in other units that already have a streamlined process for training, for drones, for all of that, for electronic warfare. I think the only rationale that would be acceptable, because politics is not acceptable, the idea of having this like NATO training and the PR that is associated with it, that's not a reasonable excuse. But what would be a good excuse, if that it is actually the case, is that Zelensky was looking to get Western equipment at a faster pace, because before the 15 brigades were created, there was a large issue with just an extended period of time, long waiting time for Ukrainian brigades when it came to receiving their equipment, receiving vehicles, artillery systems, all of that. It just took way too long. But with this idea of NATO trained Ukrainian brigades, the offer was very enticing for the European side. They liked the idea and they were more receptive to giving the equipment immediately to the Ukrainian side. And so as a result, with the example of the 155th Brigade, they received the French equipment very, very quickly, much faster than the French gave it to any other units throughout the past 2 years of war. And so, in theory, you could say that the brigade was needed in order to create like a shell company in a sort of way, and then it could be siphoned off and given to the existing brigades. That would be a reasonable understanding of why the entire scheme was created in the first place, but it doesn't explain why you have to have just a massive crisis with the command, with the infantry that could be used by other units that need them. And now they're in a state of limbo, going from one place to another. And of course, all the other issues when it comes to a lack of resources provided by the Ukrainian side. So, all in all, the blame for this, which is now being discussed by the Ukrainian side internally by their soldiers and by the people, is that the political echelon is responsible. You can't hold the officers accountable for it, even though that's what the commander in chief is trying to do, what the general staff is trying to do. The officers can't control any of this, because at the end of the day, the decision to create the 15 brigades came from the Ukrainian side to train them in France. It came from the politicians. It came from Zelensky, from Umarov, from Syrskyi. It came from Shvediuk, I think that's what he's called. He was and still is actually the commander of Operational Command West, and also the old commander of the ground forces, Alexander Pavliuk. He was removed from his position in part because of some of these scandals, because really he has a more intimate knowledge of what's going on than Zelensky in a lot of cases. He knows the inner workings of these stories, but still just did not do a proper job in dealing with the situation. So he was removed from his post. And it is not just the 155th Brigade. You also have the 152nd Jaeger Brigade, which suffered from a similar story. So it lost on a monthly basis between 300 to 800 men because of the same sort of siphoning from nearby Ukrainian units. And it only began to replenish the men and at least get a bit of a surplus when it comes to recruits, as opposed to troops being taken away in May of 2024. And that's when they started getting those men. They only started to train in August in a significant manner, but after a month of training, they were sent to Kursk. So they were supposed to act as a reserve and second line in Kursk. They did not serve primarily on the front lines, but certain portions of the unit were chipped away at by other more experienced brigades and taken to fight on the front lines in Kursk. And so that depleted some of the arsenal of the unit from the get-go before it was even able to fight as a unified force anywhere. And then by October, it was moved in its entirety to Pokrovsk and changed from Mechanized Brigade to Jaeger Brigade. And so it underwent a massive shift in command and in resource allocation structure. And so a lot of the subordinates did not even know who their platoon commanders was, and vice versa. Commanders did not know who were their subordinates. And then as a result, a lot of these people that did not know where to go, they were just assigned to new units. So the 152nd Brigade just lost a lot of its manpower during the transition. And as a result, the commanders in this brigade say that their men are fighting in 15 separate brigades. And that's just insane to think that a unit that should be together has 15 different locations where their men are located right now, where they definitely should not be, based on the ideal scenario. So that's why I'm saying that it probably should not have been formed in the first place, and it should have just been dispersed in an orderly manner. And when I'm saying it, I'm talking about the soldiers should have been assigned in an orderly manner to units that actually need that additional support and have the system built in place to accumulate and incorporate those men, because right now a lot of those units are not getting the fresh troops that are young. They're not experienced, but at least they're young. They're getting the older ones, and that of course is not suitable for long-term combat in drawn-out fighting. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully it was informative. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.